speakers giving their presentations on the various topics. If you have issues or questions you want to raise, please pop them into the chat or preferably into the Q&A. We're now moving to a panel discussion on internet fragmentation and the Splinternet. I'll now hand over to a long-standing mainstay of the internet in Australia, Mr. Chris Despain. So, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Keith. I hope you can hear me. It's good to see you. Nice to be here, albeit that I'm actually in the UK and it's fast approaching the middle of the night. But that's okay, and it's a joy to be here. Yes, the discussion today. This discussion today is all about internet fragmentation and the Splinternet. Let me briefly introduce our panel. First, an apology. Dominique Lazansky is unable to be with us today. She's currently in the depths of Finland with significant connection issues, and so she can't be with us. That means that our attempts at diversity have failed, and we find ourselves, unfortunately, with an all-male panel, but we'll do our best to entertain you nonetheless. Andrew Sullivan is joined the Internet Society as President and Chief Executive Officer in September 2018. I believe that, oh yes, their videos are now on, fantastic. Andrew's focused on internet infrastructure and standards since 2001, when he worked to launch the .info internet top-level domain. And he was part of the team that collaborated with the Internet Society to launch the public internet registry and take over the operation of the .org top-level domain. Throughout his career, Andrew's worked to establish and maintain the internet's critical value as an interoperable and neutral platform. Matt Tett joins us also this morning. Matt is the Managing Director of NX Test Lab, which is an independent accredited testing laboratory with a 30-year history. Matt's well known globally across industry and government. His organization's objective is using science to keep tech vendors honest by rigorously testing their product claims. Matt is the chair of the IoT Alliance Australia Enabler Workstream 3, Cybersecurity and Network Resilience, and sits on the Executive Council. He also serves on the Online Safety Consultative Working Group, the Office of the Safety Commissioner, and a bunch of other things as well. And last but not least, Jordan Carter is, as Rosemary said a little earlier, Outer's Internet Governance and Policy Director, who joined Outer this year as a veteran of internet policy and the domain name ministry in New Zealand at .nz. Jordan is an expert at internet policy and internet governance, and he's been involved with ICANN and the IGF for well over a decade now. So we're here today to talk about fragmentation and the Splinternet. Internet fragmentation, two words that mean many different things to different people. And part of what we're going to talk about is to try and figure out, when people talk about internet fragmentation, what is it they actually mean? Because we use that word internet to mean things like the World Wide Web, the domain name system, the network itself, and a whole heap of other things. So we're going to start with me just asking each of our panelists to give us roughly 5 minutes each on what they believe internet fragmentation actually means. What does internet fragmentation mean to you? And let's say, I'm going to do this in the order that's on my screen. So Andrew, you're up first. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
So the thing about the internet is that it's really an emergent property of a bunch of other networks, right? The networks get together, they want to interoperate with one another, and they connect to one another. And out of that behavior of these independent operators comes the internet. And the more that ability of independent operators to interoperate with one another is impeded, the more fragmented the internet is. So sometimes the discussion, it seems to me, acts as though there is a binary question to be answered. Is the internet fragmented yet? And that is the wrong way to think of it. Instead, from my point of view, what this is much more like what's happening to my hair. Am I bald yet? On any given day, there's less of it, and yet, there's no moment when you can say, "Oh, he's bald now." Instead, there is just this gradual loss of a smooth surface that we can all interact with, according to our needs and according to the needs of those operators. And that's part of the reason why this question of where exactly is which part of this is the internet and which part of it is not, is to me a little bit of a category mistake, because what we're doing there is trying to say, okay, this stuff is internet and that stuff is not. Whereas in fact, this is quite plastic. So something that is just a social media application that lives on top of the internet can turn into infrastructure if you start to use it as the login infrastructure and the identity infrastructure for the rest of the internet. And this ability of one piece of the internet to turn into infrastructure for another piece of the internet is part of what makes the magic of the internet into this marvelous application that has eaten all other kinds of networking. Right? That it's just taken over. And the reason it has is precisely because of this ability to recombine itself in all sorts of interesting ways. So that to me is why this is such a knotty problem, because there isn't really a clear line where you can say, yep, it's fragmented now and that's definitely the internet. Can't do either one of those things.
Thank you. We'll get back to a lot of that when the others have had their say. Let's go to Matt now. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I tend to agree with Andrew, but probably go down a few more rabbit holes. There are parallel internets. We already have those. It's already known. We've got the web, we've got the dark web, we've got industrial applications, commercial applications, cloud, Internet of Things, everything. As many of you would know, my technical background's across both networking and security, coming from the days of dial-up 30 plus years ago, and particularly security, and the security now of the connected devices. That's what we're seeing: industrial, critical infrastructure, and then even just the Internet of Things in general, with people looking for features and functionality in their homes and their lives. So our professional life is obviously testing and evaluation of those vendors' claims about their products and services, good, bad, and indifferent. And what we've witnessed over a number of years are the standards defining organisations and the government departments and agencies actually feeding into this. So you see, everyone has their own silos, everyone has their own remits. The issue that we've always known is the internet technically doesn't have any theoretical borders, even though there are geopolitical borders. And a good example of that, which I was thinking of given the 5 minutes notice that I had to come on here, was recently in the world of Internet of Things is the Five Eyes, well, not even recently, 2019, so 3 years ago, the Five Eyes nations, all ministers signed a statement of intent, a joint statement of intent around securing Internet of Things and encouraging industry to step up and effectively self-regulate. So start applying the guidelines and the codes that the governments had developed in those nations. Now that's only 5 countries, but it was still good to see 5 countries united and publishing a statement. Have we seen the vendors make that change? Some of them have, some of them haven't. And so therefore we start seeing regulation and legislation. So we heard from Richard yesterday talking about it's not an easy job being a regulator. And I think at the end of the day, having to police these sorts of things across multi-jurisdictions and multi-systems, it's very difficult. And the vendors do like to sit back and say, well, it's not our responsibility, or why would we want to comply in one jurisdiction or another? It's a global issue, and we really need to look at that as a global issue. So the World Economic Forum came out earlier this year and said, enough's enough. There's so many standards, there's so many guidelines, there's so many codes, there's so much proposed legislation or legislation currently going through regulating security around the Internet of Things. We need to harmonize it, we need to consolidate it. And 400 organizations actually signed up for that. So we're trying to deal with this every day, and it's really, really difficult to actually decide. Luckily, with all the standards that are existing in the world at the moment that are in development or are currently developed and mature, none of them actually contradict each other from a security perspective, but it's one thing to have standards, another thing to get the vendors actually on board. So yeah, we have still got a Wild West. It is 40 years old, but what else can we do? As with everything, it can be used for good or bad. And who will be the global internet police? That's who I want to know. And it is critical that there's no one single point of failure. So standards, legislation, government policy, budgets, we need a global consensus, but we are seeing that Splinternet happening already.
Thank you, Matt. Interesting take from a standards point of view. We'll circle back on that in a little while. Jordan, your thoughts?
Thanks, Chris, and good morning, everyone. It's nice to be joining this community as a member of it instead of visiting from across the sea, coming to you from out of these days. Look, I want to take a little bit of time to tease out some thoughts and some examples, and to get you thinking as part of this definition thing. And where I start from on this is the concept of the internet as a network of networks, as Andrew said. There are hugely diverse network technologies, computing infrastructures, services, all woven together by the fabric that is the internet. And fragmentation, to me, starts out by being any process that undermines or undoes that fabric. That means that the concept of an internet cannot continue. And I do agree with the point that Andrew and others have made, that it isn't a sudden binary. You're not going to wake up without an internet after going to sleep with it. So you think about these things in terms of pressures or trends that take you in a more or less fragmented, a more or less united direction. I think at the technical level, there are some things that could be definitely said to be fragmentation that probably none of us would argue about. If there was the demise of an authoritative namespace and other vital identifiers that are available and reliable everywhere, that would probably make things quite difficult. If there's a demise of a coherent and reliable routing system that meant that traffic couldn't find its way reliably everywhere, that would also probably be a pretty key fragmentation moment. And some examples just to get you thinking about things that might meet those. The European Union is talking about DNS for EU, 5 letters and a number. If they required its use, made it mandatory, and then decided that because they'd made it mandatory, they would have their own root zone as well, that could be a pretty significant fragmentation moment, with 500 million people in the EU suddenly in a different realm, a different address space, a different namespace. If a group of networks ceased recognizing authoritative issuance of ASNs by the regional internet registries and started duplicating those, that would probably be a pretty significant technical fragmentation moment. If various forms of encryption got banned within a jurisdiction for one reason or another, and suddenly parts of the internet had to start ignoring other parts because they thought it was unsafe, that would probably be pretty clearly in the fragmentation camp as well. But of course, the internet isn't just about technology. And a lot of people think the internet is Facebook, or the internet is the things that they do online. They use it as some kind of jumbly sort of thing that they kind of know what they mean when they say it, but what they mean when they say it might be quite different to what I mean when I say it. And that's why this is so hard, to even define fragmentation, because you have to make an assumption about what we mean by internet. And so I want you to keep that in mind as I pose some questions for you. And I've tried to layer these in a way that goes from technical to less technical. Are diverse broadband connectivity technologies fragmentation? Are diverse copyright policies and enforcement postures fragmentation? Is censorship of certain forms of content imposed by national regulators? Is that internet fragmentation? Would a global service provider's decision to be available or not available in a particular geography, is that fragmentation if Cloudflare stopped working in Australia? Restrictions on transporter data flows to keep data safe or to provide digital sovereignty, is that internet fragmentation? If the ITU standards development tracks started competing and trying to develop similar standards to what the IETF does, fragmentation? Here's a quote from an ICANN session on this last month. the breakdown of consensus and agreement of what is necessary to constitute a global internet. Is that fragmentation? Is a non-universal internet experience for users fragmentation? Now, you've probably as a group got different yeses and nos. And if I had to take a guess, there might be a bit of a bell curve, or not really a bell curve, it would be a declining slope where the higher up the stack I go, the less likely you are to think that it's fragmentation of the internet. You know, as long as there is at a technical level, the ability to weave together that interconnection of different networks, there's going to be an internet, but people aren't tech purists, right? So how far we go up the stack kind of depends a little bit on how far we want to integrate user concerns and issues into our internet governance work, if you call dealing with fragmentation an internet governance question. And that's a big question that we all need to grapple with as an internet community, right? Because our internet governance institutions are quite good at dealing with those critical resources, but they're sort of designed not to deal with those higher up the stack issues. And at the same time, when other people try to deal with those issues, when governments try and regulate, when corporates make decisions, there's often a bit of a drawn breath and a view, oh no, well, we don't want you to do that. And people say, well, are you going to solve the problem? And we say, no, 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 that's not our business. And they'll say, well, we'll solve the problem. And we say, no, 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 don't do it like that. So there's a bit of a gap there, and governments will fill it if internet governance doesn't. So I think that's something, a broader macro point I just wanted to make. If internet governance is going to be anything, it does need to be preserving that open, global, interoperable infrastructure. It needs to preserve that fabric of the internet. But if we draw it too narrowly and leave it detached from those broader social concerns, those later questions I asked, I think we're heading for trouble. When we leave the field and leave those challenges to other people, it's hard to complain if they act. And it's our job to make sure that when they act, they can act in a knowledgeable and insightful way, which is why forums like NetThing are so important, to get that dialogue going between the technology and all the other decision makers, and, you know, as we try not to call them, all the other multi-stakeholders are involved. So I hope that's got you thinking about a few concrete examples, and I will hand back to Chris to orchestrate.
Thanks, Jordan. Thank you. I have a feeling that, that probably Andrew and Matt will be interested in picking up and responding to what you've said. Andrew, why don't you go first?
Thank you, and thank you both to Jordan and Matt. I do think that there is something that we sometimes forget to talk about, which is kind of piling on to the point that Jordan was making about you get sort of high enough in the stack and you start to think, well, it's not really an internet problem. I think that's true, but I think it's only true at a certain scale. And one of the things that we have started to see over the last several years are these, hyperscale sort of applications, which are really walled gardens. And those things are contributing in some way to a fragmentation of the internet as well. That is, if you start to be dependent for your internet experience on, just one service provider or just one sort of high-level social media function or something like that, you're not really having the internet experience. I have this theory that governments in the 1990s would have gone for regulation that would have tended to fragment the internet, or for that matter, prevented its taking off, if they could have done it. But the problem was that in the 1990s, there were just so many people that it was like, trying to herd flies. There were just so many that you couldn't possibly do it. And one of the possible reasons that we're seeing the reemergence of a whole lot of discussions that, if you've been around as long as I have, many of these discussions seem remarkably familiar. They are familiar. They're the same sorts of ideas. Only now what we see is you can get, 6 or 8 very large companies in the room and give them a good talking to and tell them how things are going to be. And everything else is just so far in the long tail that you just cannot care about it. That is a kind of fragmentation, I think, of the internet experience, because as we develop regulatory environments that are, let's face it, they're tuned for these particular large organizations, they also tend to shape the networks in favor of those kinds of operations. And then what you have is a gradual erosion of the ability of the network to be really, really plastic and be used for all of these other different ways. So I think that you're quite right. Historically in the internet governance conversation, the further away you get from like sort of transport, the more people say, well, that isn't really internet fragmentation. And yet the transport is in some sense being undermined by that because of this tendency of the internet to be encapsulated. And when you're getting it encapsulated in, pick your favorite social media network, suddenly you really do have a problem that you've fragmented the network because only that social media operator really has the ability to dictate what the terms are like. And so I think there's a fragmentation drift that is certainly happening there.
Thanks, Andrew. Matt, do you have any comments on what's been said so far?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I tend to agree with Jordan and Andrew to a certain extent, but I think if you try and, I'm always a good one for analogies. I like to think of analogies and where we're at. And I look back to the railroads and different narrow gauges and wide gauges, and the costs and benefits of having those. Even in Australia, it's such a small country, and we had those sort of issues when we were rolling out the infrastructure at the state borders. And this is a very similar thing we're seeing now. And we've seen it evolve, but like it doesn't happen overnight. We've already said that. But at the end of the day, as applications become more specific and I guess the internet becomes more rich, we're starting to see organizations and particularly governments beginning to struggle with trying to police, surveil and regulate those sort of environments. And to have someone come in and say, okay, we're going to have left-hand drive cars and you're going to have right-hand drive cars, or we're going to have this policy or that policy, or in this state we have this kind of driver's license, and that state you have this kind of driver's license, and these are the rules and requirements. I think it's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole in a lot of cases. And then you have the technicalities of actually doing that enforcement or doing that surveillance and making sure that the providers and the vendors can actually meet those requirements, regulations with the lowest amount of impost. I mean, we've worked with vendors before that said, we won't sell this product in this country if we have to comply with these requirements. And you kind of get where they're coming from. And then therefore that's splintering it even further, because there's another country which is disadvantaged because of a vendor commercial aspect, commercial policy, which has been driven by a burden of regulatory compliance. And yeah, I'm not arguing one or the other, but it's happening. And yeah, hopefully we can see our way through it.
Okay.
Chris, can I make one quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Jordan. I was just about to. Go ahead, please. Yes.
Just on the point that Andrew raised, I love the "Let the Thousand Flowers Bloom" thing that made regulation impossible. But I think it was Ram Mohan at an event I was at recently from Identity Digital, Ram, not the event, who talked about the importance of thinking about who benefits from that islands situation. If we have like a Facebook internet and a Google internet, just to use two well-known brands, not casting any shade, who benefits from the withdrawal? Is it governments? Is it internet users? Is it the corporates involved? I think keeping that sort of interest analysis as part of our dialogue and analysis is really important, because that can help us focus in on leverage points and just understanding things that might be driving the dynamics that if you forget about that, you might overlook.
Yeah, thank you. Just before I go on, I just want to sort of give a heads up to the people listening and watching. We want participation. If you've been involved in discussions around any of these aspects and you want to talk about what you discussed at your event, you can do so. Please put your hand up when we get there, or questions and so on. I just want to remind everybody that this is that our goal here is to be interactive and not just to listen to us for chatting on for the next however long it is, 25 minutes, 35 minutes. So look, it's clear, isn't it, that fragmentation, as I think, as I said at the beginning, it means different things to different people, never mind about internet meaning different things to different people. So it makes the question, does internet fragmentation matter, an impossible question to ask, because of course the answer to that is entirely dependent on what it is you mean when you say fragmentation. So I mean, Matt, you've been pretty clear about the need for standards and fragmenting from that side of things. Let's think about some examples of things that may be considered to be fragmentation, and whether they matter or not. I mean, one of the kickstarters for this conversation at a global political level was a suggestion not that long ago in respect to the issues with Russia and Ukraine, and the possibility of having Russia's global internet access affected because of their position in respect to Ukraine. Andrew, that it didn't happen. From my point of view, it was never going to happen, but would that be fragmentation in your view?
There's a lot of fragmentation that comes from those kinds of shutdowns. And I think while it's true that nobody in the world was successful at the plan to take Russia off the internet, which seemed to be the proposal that people were making, there's been a lot of success at fragmenting the network experience in Russia, some of which is being undertaken by the government of Russia themselves. It's a sort of bitter tragedy to watch Russia, which had really, really very good infrastructure, to watch them disassemble the robust infrastructure that they had in some kind of effort to protect themselves from, I don't know, malign bits that are coming from the West or something like that. And this is a real shame. We can see this actually in the invasion of Ukraine, because they keep changing they keep cutting off high connectivity that Ukrainian network operators had, and forcing them to go, in some cases, through much worse network infrastructure. What you actually want to do under those circumstances, of course, is add another one. It's yes and. It should, you should always have more redundancy. That's really what we should be looking for. And instead, what people are trying to do is peel that back and cut back to the minimum number of network operations. And this is true in kind of residential or business service provision. It's true in backhaul operations. Some of you may be aware, I'm in Canada, and we have a large operator here called Rogers. There was this bitter irony not that long ago when Rogers had a very bad day. They, lost their entire network, both the mobile and the fixed line, and our internet and telecommunications regulator, the CRTC, was shut down because they didn't have any redundancy. And this is the kind of thing that you see, and you want to say, well, this is fragmentation. This is the failure, because magically the internet doesn't fragment when you've got lots of redundancy. That's kind of one of the magic techniques of it. And so what we want to do is promote that. And I think that that's something that we haven't actually been able to impress upon policymakers.
We had two questions in the chat, but one of them seems to have disappeared. That may just be me pressing the wrong button. But before I go to the first question, does anybody have anything that they wanted to add to Andrew's comments in respect to the big political picture? Don't feel you have to, but if you want, no, okay. So I'm going to come back to this question, which is in the Q&A pod. Is really the onset or underlying influence here the drive by business and society for commercial benefit? Money is a huge motivator. Matt, do you want to, given that you talk most about the commercial side of things and standards, etc., do you want to have a go at that to start with?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, people need to make money and make a living, and organizations need to flourish. It just depends at what cost. So one thing is value and the other thing is cost. So are they delivering value to society? Are they delivering value to consumers who ultimately have to be the beneficiary of the technology that they're delivering, particularly if they're funding it? Or do they have some ulterior motive? And I think that's the thing that we see from a security perspective when people put profits over, I guess, the privacy and the safety of people. So a lot of people confuse privacy, safety, and security. And we in security can underpin privacy and safety, but we can't deliver it. So if we could deliver that, then we'd all be driving around in very secure and safe automobiles. So yeah, profit,
we are.
money, yeah. People are still dying, unfortunately, and people are still.
Well, I
having
can solve that
incidents.
problem. I can solve that problem for you. Just reduce the speed limit to 0, and then everything will be fine.
Stop driving.
But stop driving, exactly. Jordan, do you want to tackle the question that was the long question that was set out for you? You can see it, I think, if rather than have me read it out. Do you want to address it?
Yeah, sure, Chris. It was asking what I thought the overall level of knowledge new generations have of internet governance and multi-stakeholderism is. I suspect it's relatively low. I don't know if that's new generations or all generations, because you have to say it's a bit of a niche topic. And what is ADA doing to close that gap? I think part of what we're doing is growing our team that's working on this and talking about these issues more, trying to raise the profile, supporting events like NetThing, and thinking about how we can sort of accelerate and sustain a growing dialogue about these issues in the Australian internet community. So that'd be hard to sort of answer that. The two other questions to the broader panel asked, how much does the lack of knowledge on the civil society level about internet governance issues deepen issues related to the fragmentation of the internet? And what obstacles do you see that diminish the chances of civil society participation on internet governance issues? I've got a reckon on both of those. And one of my reckons is that because the internet is so all pervasive and affects and touches so many people so much of the time, it's a little bit like electricity sometimes. I mean, there isn't really an electricity user's discipline. It's just kind of there and it works and we take it for granted. So I think compared with the early days of the internet, when it was novel and new, it's an exciting new thing that a few nerdy people knew about and were doing, and it was attracting attention like that. I suspect it's a bit harder to generate mainline social interest in this. So part of the obstacle is the very ubiquity and success of it. But I'll leave it for others to comment further on that.
Fair enough. I've got another couple of, at least one other question in the chat, which I'm going to get to in a second. But before that, so we bounced the Russia-Ukraine thing around for a minute or two, and Andrew, you talked about what Russia's doing that in effect is causing its own fragmentation, and of course it would be nonsensical for the governing bodies to shut down their access to the internet. Wouldn't achieve anything. Just put the boot on the other foot for a second. Today in Iran, I think I'm right in saying that in order to stop reporting on the protests, they closed access to the internet. Do we think that it is that it should be within an individual government's remit to block that if they wish? And is that fragmentation?
Well, it's definitely fragmentation from my point of view. I mean, realistically, given what governments are and our theory of sovereignty and so on in the contemporary world, governments do have the right to do that. I would like to persuade them that this is a terrible thing to do to themselves. That if you are really going to throw away the opportunity to use the most cost efficient and generative technology for communication and human development that we have invented in maybe 100 years, you are willfully destroying or undermining the development of the people who are living within the society that you pretend to govern. And I think that that's a terrible thing to do. So I think it's wrong. I think it's something that governments shouldn't do. And the government of Iran is by no means alone in this, right? We see this all the time.
No.
Many of the shutdowns are for ridiculous reasons, right? Oh, we're going to shut down the internet because of national exams, and we have to protect everybody from cheating. And this is, I mean, if somebody said, well, the water system is being used by tapping on the pipes for students to cheat, so we're going to turn off all of the water for 3 days, nobody would tolerate it. They would think that that's a crazy idea to do. But for some reason, we're prepared to do that with the internet. And I think it's because We failed to understand what it is, and we failed to build the infrastructure in a way that is really resistant to this. And that's what we ought to be encouraging people to do, to build the infrastructure the way the Russian infrastructure really was built, that it was so resilient. It shouldn't, you shouldn't be able to turn it off. And it took them 10 years to undo enough, or to do enough damage that they could turn it off. And I think that that's a shame. We should be pushing people instead very much in the other direction to try to ensure that the internet is there and available for everyone all the time.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that, Jordan or Matt, before I move on to Narel's question?
Well, we did see that with the convergence of communications when there were the issues with 000 here in Australia, and having that I guess legacy policy from communications network providers, and what constitutes national infrastructure of significance. So yeah, it's internet as it moves and evolves into that sort of critical infrastructure is absolutely imperative that we ensure the integrity of it from both governments and from potential attackers here and overseas.
I'd just
Thanks,
add,
Matt.
as
Yes,
well
Jordan.
that the one of the key reasons we have to care about this stuff is maybe this sounds idealistic, but that awesome human possibility that is around being able to communicate with anyone and learn from anyone and everywhere. And the idea that that should be cut off at the whim of some communications minister somewhere, or broken by some bizarre geopolitical fight in some legacy UN institution is just intolerable. And so there's a big responsibility on us, right? Whether you call it fragmentation or splintering, to do everything we can, and really everything we can, not just genuflection or token efforts, to make sure that future doesn't come about.
I am a little bit concerned about this thing I've heard called the printing press. I hear the church is up in arms about that, so we've got to be careful of this thing.
It's if it ever takes off, it's going to be incredibly dangerous. There's a question in the chat from Narel, which Keith has typed an answer into, but let's bounce it around you three. Does the group think that there are any urgent calls to action on the issue of potential internet fragmentation, particularly that we in the Asia Pacific can act on? For example, the greater regulation under the banner of national security, or threats to IPv4 address space management from scarcity. Anybody want to have a go at that one?
Just a quick riff on it. I think the key action that we need to take, and I'm new in this community in a direct sense, so feel free to tell me that I'm wrong, but a well-planned, well-considered 10, 20, 30-year time horizon about these issues and what an agenda is that Australia can play and the region can play to keep this kind of, what we would call in New Zealand a taonga, treasure, as not as it is, because it needs to keep evolving and changing, but to keep those sort of characteristics of the internet human friendly, human useful, does require that, and that time horizon, some agreed strategy and a clear kind of practical commitment to showing up and being involved in the dialogues involved. So I think sometimes, possibly unfair example, but I can, before the stewardship transition, as an example, would sometimes just rely on the United States to do all the heavy lifting. The State Department will take care of that. We don't need to worry. I think if we're going to have a multi-stakeholder governance process that helps deliver the internet that we want, we have to be involved with it and do the work of showing up and making it work, rather than letting these institutions sort of atrophy and fade away. So that's one practical thing I think that people can do, is get involved in the internet governance institutions that relate to their areas of work. Yeah,
and I think without wishing to be, I'll get to 1 second, Andrew, without wishing to overplug. That applies just as much in individual countries, in outer, in ZNZ, in all of those national and regional organizations. We always used to say it's a little bit difficult to go into the world and claim that the multi-stakeholder model is the best way of dealing with all of this stuff, but to fail to make the effort at home. You have to do both, I think. Andrew, you were going to say something.
Well, I would say, I mean, yes, in Asia Pacific, but in fact, everybody all over the world can tackle something. So at the Internet Society, I'm going to plug a thing that we did for a moment here. I hope you'll indulge me. We created over the last couple of years this effort, which we call the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. And the reason we did this was because we were looking at the way the regulations were coming in, and we realized, hey, we've actually got a model for this. And that model is what we do when we build physical infrastructure, or we make changes to the physical infrastructure, we make laws about those things. We do an environmental assessment to decide, hey, is this such a good idea? Is this going to destroy the watershed, or is this going to, destroy the ecosystem for various animals at risk, or various other kinds of things? And those things are usually a cost-benefit analysis, right? And you just have to think about, well, what are all the costs, all of the different kinds of implications of this? And so we've tried to create a sort of similar process where people can do these things with laws and regulations that are being proposed, and do an impact assessment to try to understand, hey, what does that do to this? I think somewhere in the chat, somebody was asking about this question, is it just that, some of the politicians and policymakers don't really understand what they're doing? And I think there is a significant part of that, if you think of most of the people who are doing policy work, in any legislative office these days, they're young people. They've never lived without the internet. And for them, this is just a smooth thing. The internet, it's a countdown. You can pick it up and move it 10 centimeters to the left. And the problem is that's not what the internet is like. But we have to, those of us who know something about how this infrastructure works, need to do that analysis, for the same reason that environmental activists needed those environmental analyses to say, I understand why you want to build a bridge there, but you're going to kill all the whales. That seems like a bad thing. And I think that we need to take that kind of urgency as well. We're going to lose these opportunities that the internet brings us because of this regulation or that one. And you could tweak your regulation and get the outcome you wanted by and still be compatible with the internet in this other way. So I urge people to have a look at that toolkit. And if you need any help in doing those analyses and so on, we have staff who are anxiously standing by to try to help you. But we can't do it all alone. We're too small.
Standing by on the phones as we speak. Okay, let's go back a couple of steps. We've established, I think, that we think that the turning off a nation would obviously be a major problem, and fragmentation, and the attempts by nations themselves to create their own intranet, whatever you want to call it, is also fragmentation, and as Andrew said, doesn't really make a whole heap of sense if you want to take full advantage of all the goodness that the internet can bring. Let's take another couple of examples, something more subtle. What about countries, territories that legislate that if you want to do business, if you want to, let's use the DNS as an example. If you want to sell domain names in my country, then you need to do the following things. You need to take full details of all the people who are going to buy those names, and you need to give them to me if I ask you for them. Now, is that not my sovereign right as a government to decide that that's what I want to do? And if that simply means that none of the global top-level domain registries or registrars come and sell in my country, then that's perfectly okay. Is that fragmentation as well?
Well, it's certainly kind of hair loss, right? What you're doing is gradually chipping away at this thing. And so, yeah, in one sense, well, there are other identifiers there, who cares? On the other hand, now this is a way in which this doesn't work as well with other things. And so, these pile up. Eventually, you're going to get to the point where things don't really interoperate with one another. And I think that's one of the concerns that I have about the way this is very frequently put, that, if you've got a Splinternet or so on, is it splintered yet? That's not really the question we have to ask ourselves. The question is this drifting in the right direction or not? Now, again, I am not a sovereign government. I'm not in a position to tell these sovereign governments, hey, this is a crazy idea. But some of these ideas are crazy ideas. They don't work. And the reason they don't work is because it undermines the ability of the network to operate that way. And what it will do is create an environment in which some people who have technical sophistication will simply work around your damage. Whereas other people will be stuck in this thing, and you're essentially creating an internet underclass that I think is wrong. I think that that's a wrong thing to do. But I recognize that it may be a national policy of government.
Yes, and it is it not the way that, no offense intended, is it not the way that most governments operate anyway, which is that they make it more difficult for ordinary people to do stuff, whilst the guys who can get around it continue to get around it by finding another way to get around it. Jordan, Matt, did you want to have a say on that? Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I think two observations that we've made over the last 4 or 5 years. First is the government obviously aim to be open and consultative, and they go out to market to get industry opinion and feedback, and obviously have public consultation. A lot of the times you even read the policy documentation before it even comes out, or the discussion documentation before it comes out, and you can almost see there's a preconceived idea or an agenda that they have. And so regardless, lo and behold, at the end of the public consultation, all the papers are out there, all the papers are published, yet really there's that agenda which has just been pushed straight through. And that is really difficult when you have some highly technical people who know on the ground exactly what they're doing, and they know if that policy goes through, that it's going to make their lives hell to try and implement and enforce it, or it's not even enforceable. You can't even implement it, and how is it going to be policed and regulated? So really, it's a lot of time and effort for essentially what it is to build a silo. Flip side, working with organisations in, I guess, a large overseas, I guess the dog that shakes the tail. Recently, we had the instance where they went out public consultation, really good agenda, really good objectives. Unfortunately, most of their manufacturers and vendors didn't like the policy tack that the government was taking. And essentially the outcome was, unless we got significant tax incentives, we wouldn't comply with this, and we wouldn't support it and endorse it. And the government came out and said, we're not in a position to give you any more further incentives to promote and endorse your companies. And they said, well, therefore we can't follow through with the policy. So that was a purely commercial drawn decision to the detriment of their consumers and I guess society in general. The government had a really good policy, but the organizations actually influenced them to back down from it. And that's really frustrating when they're supposed to be one of the world leaders. So, you know, it makes it difficult for the rest of us to do what we're supposed to be doing with the objective of a fair playing field, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
I think your example,
Jordan,
Chris,
did you want to quick? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just your example, I think, about the requiring records don't use DNS otherwise, is whether or not it's fragmentation, it's a bad thing with a capital B and a capital T, from the perspective of a sort of globally shared information space and so on. It doesn't really help. I don't think it helps very much because, as you say, people get around. I think it illustrates another thing, a bit of a hunch, that policymaking often happens really fast, and it doesn't always, I don't know the way to say this as diplomatically as perhaps I should, but it doesn't always pay attention to reality. The reality that policy responds to is the political reality rather than technical reality or community reality. Sometimes, not other times, but sometimes. And so one of the things that idealistic me thinks can help with that is that we, to the extent that we've got a good agenda and a good sort of pre-dialogue going on around some of these trickier issues, that brings in policymakers and so on, the less likely it is to suddenly see a problem emerge that leads to a sudden random shift in policy. So I think that's something that we as an internet community can do more about.
Yep, I agree with that. I think that's exactly right. So we have 10 minutes left. If I can encourage anybody who does have questions to pop them into the Q&A pod now, that's fine. That would be great because we may well get to them. I want to go to another example and perhaps the other end of the scale. We've talked about governments, we've talked about regulation, we've talked about all of that. Let's go to the other end. Let's talk about innovation. So a blockchain identifies fragmentation, is having the possibility of an identifier on blockchains that are set up to look like domain names. They have a dot, they're dot this, they're dot that, and so on and so forth. Is that fragmentation? Do we care about that? Go on, Andrew.
One question we have to ask ourselves, and there's some of this in a side conversation that was in the chat here, is it really comes down to this interoperable question. So if what you have is a set of, like, a new set of identifiers that is somehow like fits with the old kind of identifier system, and it kind of interoperates with it in some way, you know, more or less, then this isn't necessarily fragmentation, although it might be like a really unpleasant user experience for users who are unfamiliar with that identifier system. If on the other hand, it's an explicit attack on the identifier system, that is, it has the same semantics and it doesn't have the same operational qualities, now you're talking about a very different thing, right? And that's just a split root in the domain name system, even though the other root is using a different protocol. You know, in that case, it's a formally incompatible system. And so this is an example of what Jordan was talking about, where the details really matter in how this thing is implemented, and where people are trying to layer this into the DNS to continue to work with it. The way, for instance, people were very, very worked up about the handle system a few years ago. Well, if you look at how that thing works, it turns out you look it up in the DNS under doi.org. Well, okay, that's just completely compatible with the DNS in that sense, because you literally look it up in there. And at that point, you know, this is just a different system. And that's one of the nice things about the internet, right? You can deploy all of these new things on here without asking anybody's permission. Hey, A+, that's a great thing to do. I think, you know, the question now is, what's your deployment strategy? And I think in that case, maybe it's not so great. But
so the innovation is fine. It's if you try and overlay it onto the existing infrastructure in a way that causes clashing and problems, then it becomes a disaster. Is what you're,
yeah, I think you can't break stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean that should be, you know, do no, what was Google's thing? Do no evil or something. So don't break stuff. That should maybe be our thing. There was a question from Keith in the chat, which was Keith Besborough, which was, it may well be that fragmentation doesn't matter so very much, but what about the issue of the Splinternet, which I take to mean the breakdown into separate blocks of networks with separate systems of governance?
I'll have a go at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that matters a lot, Keith, and it's a good sort of scenario to paint, because one countervailing thought is that 10 years or so ago, the International Telecommunications Regulations, the ITRs, were negotiated at an ITU conference, and that ended up with two different sets of ITRs going on, which some countries have signed, and that doesn't seem to have broken the phone network. But I think if we had truly separate governance structures, like say 25 countries bought into a Splinternet that was organized on the sort of principles and network technologies that two random countries like China and Russia had developed, for example. And another set of countries bought into a Japan net, and North America had a North America net, and North America net was run by ICANN, and there was a standards body in Ulaanbaatar that ran the Asia net. Those things would be problematical. Either there would be carefully monitored interaction between them, which would defeat the ability of people to find as much information and share as much communication as they can, or they wouldn't even, it just wouldn't work. You'd be sending an email to someone on the other side of the world and it would never get there, and you'd never know, except if you phoned them to find out, or maybe sent them a fax if you were really desperate. So I think that is a real problem. And where that comes back to our work is, if we've got an internet governance system that can't draw in enough support, or at least tolerance, from enough countries, that is the future that might arise. And so a stone-headed defense of the current model being perfection is the worst thing we could do, because it would guarantee that outcome, which would be bad for everyone. So I think the evolution and change of the network, we've got an institutional structure that's largely built off an age of American supremacy. And we don't have those geopolitics anymore. So it's natural the governance system is going to have to be assessed and flexed so that it can buy enough consent from enough people, enough of the time, that the enduring sort of fabric of the internet can continue.
Jordan, thank you. I'm going to take that as your closing comment, because with 4 minutes to go, I want to give 2 minutes to Matt and 2 minutes to Andrew. Matt, why don't you go first? Just to sum up and give us a couple of minutes, and then I'll throw it to Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot to be learned from lessons past, but we can also shape the future based on history. So things like the printing press, passports, border control, train systems, automotive industry, the safety and the privacy aspects that consumers or users or citizens have been looking at to their government to govern and police aren't necessarily there on the internet. We're not there yet. The internet is a fragmented series of networks to start with, as we started off saying, but let's try not to regulate that into policy if we can avoid it, because at the end of the day, as I said, consumers have to be the beneficiary of the technology that they're being delivered, and I think that often gets lost by the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Andrew?
I think Matt is right on about something here, and I think the analogy with the automotive industry is a good one. You know, the American automotive industry in particular was dragged kicking and screaming into doing anything about automotive safety, and what ended up happening was the government made a bunch of rules for them and specified how it was going to work. And the same thing with pollution controls. And the unfortunate effect of that was that over time, improvements couldn't be made to the thing because the specifications ended up in the legislation. And if instead the industry had embraced this and really taken off and said, hey, we're going to make this really good, don't worry about it, then actually the industry would have been much safer and would have also produced safer cars and would have had an easier time of it. And, you know, General Motors probably wouldn't have gone bankrupt in the middle of the 2020s. So I think that's a lesson for us, a cautionary tale for us.
Thank you. So it's been a really interesting discussion. I hope everybody understands this is the beginning of what is a much longer discussion that hopefully everybody can have over time, and that maybe we can circle back in a year's time at the 2023 NetThing and talk about what's happened in the last 12 months, and it'll be good stuff. A really big thank you to Andrew and to Jordan, and especially to Matt, who literally arrived at the last minute, armed and ready to participate in the debate and the discussion. Thank you to all three of you. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Keith. Keith, back to you.
Actually, it's back to me, or over to me.
So, Sandra, I'm so sorry. Back to you. Over to you, Sandra. My apologies.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. That was a really great panel, and I learned a lot. So, again, thanks. And Matt, I think it's indicative of the contribution that each of us makes to the community when you can ring someone at 10:05 and have them participate on a panel at 10:30. So thanks again, Matt, and Chris, of course, for your midnight contribution. We're going to take a break. It's about to